The blood dripped from Marguerite Reynolds' split lip as she stumbled through the moonlit prairie, her cotton dress torn at the hem and her dark hair falling from its pins. Behind her, the lights of Fort Smith flickered like accusing eyes, but she couldn't go back, not after what Harrison had done tonight. It was May of 1876, and Marguerite had been married for exactly 2 years and 3 months to a man she now knew was a monster. The bruises hidden beneath her sleeves had become her shameful secret, but tonight had been different. Tonight, Harrison had come home drunk from the saloon, reeking of whiskey and perfume, and when she'd asked where he'd been, he'd wrapped his hands around her throat until stars danced before her eyes. "You're my wife," he'd snarled. "You don't ask questions." When he'd finally released her, she'd fallen to the floor gasping. While he stumbled to their bedroom to pass out, she'd grabbed what little money she had hidden in her sewing basket, the locket her mother had given her, and fled into the Arkansas night. Now she was miles from town, her feet blistered and her lungs burning. The vast wilderness of the frontier stretched before her, and for the first time in her life, Marguerite had no plan. At 22, she had escaped one prison only to find herself lost in an even more frightening one, the untamed West. The distant rumble of thunder made her quicken her pace. Rain would wash away her tracks, but it might also be the death of her if she couldn't find shelter. The silhouette of a small farmstead appeared in the distance, a lone sentinel against the darkening sky. A modest cabin with a large barn beside it stood nestled against a backdrop of cottonwood trees. Marguerite hesitated, her heart pounding. A stranger's home could mean safety or further danger. Harrison had friends throughout the territory, men who wouldn't think twice about returning a runaway wife to her husband. The first fat raindrops began to fall as she crept toward the barn. Light shone from the cabin windows, but the barn doors were partially open, offering the promise of dry hay and darkness to hide in. She slipped inside just as the skies opened. The comforting smell of hay and horses greeted her, along with the soft nickering of at least 3 animals in their stalls. Marguerite crept deeper into the shadows, finding a ladder that led to a hayloft. Her hands trembled as she climbed, her body aching with every movement. Above, she burrowed into the sweet-smelling hay, creating a nest where she could hide. She hadn't eaten since morning, and her stomach cramped with hunger, but exhaustion soon overwhelmed her. As rain drummed against the roof, Marguerite closed her eyes, wondering how long she could hide before Harrison came looking for her. Morning arrived with golden light filtering through the barn's wooden slats. Marguerite awoke with a start, momentarily confused by her surroundings until the memories of the previous night came flooding back. She touched her lip gingerly, feeling the crusted blood there. The sound of boots on packed earth made her freeze. Someone was entering the barn. "Easy there, Domino," came a deep voice with a slight drawl. "Looks like that storm got you all riled up." Marguerite held her breath, peering through a crack in the hayloft floor. Below, a tall man with broad shoulders moved among the horses, his movements gentle as he checked each animal. She couldn't see his face clearly, just the worn leather of his vest and the dusty brim of his hat. "Someone's been in here," he muttered suddenly, stopping to examine something on the ground. Marguerite's heart thundered in her chest. She'd left footprints in the dust. The man looked up directly toward the hayloft. "I know you're up there," he called, his voice firm but not angry. "I don't want no trouble. Why don't you come on down so we can talk face to face?" For a long moment, Marguerite considered remaining silent, but she knew she'd been caught. Slowly, she rose from her hiding place and approached the edge of the loft. "I mean no harm," she said, her voice raspy from thirst. "The storm caught me and I just needed shelter for the night." "A woman!" The surprise was evident in his tone. "Madam, that loft ain't no place for a lady. Come down from there before you hurt yourself." Reluctantly, Marguerite descended the ladder, keeping one hand on the worn wood to steady herself. When she reached the bottom, she finally looked up to meet the gaze of the barn's owner. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 28 or 30, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' growth of beard. His eyes, a startling shade of blue, widened at the sight of her face. "Jesus," he breathed. "Someone worked you over good." Marguerite touched her bruised cheek self-consciously. "I should go," she whispered, moving toward the door. The man stepped sideways, blocking her path. "Hold on now. You're hurt, and by the looks of you, you haven't eaten in a while." He kept his distance, hands raised slightly as if to show he meant no threat. "I've got food in the house, coffee too." She regarded him warily. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." "Name's Xavier Prescott," he said, removing his hat to reveal thick brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Most folks call me Zav, and I help because that's what decent folks do out here. Territory's hard enough without turning away someone in need." Marguerite hesitated, weighing her options. She had nowhere to go, no food, and Harrison would be looking for her by now. "I'm Marguerite," she finally said, omitting her married name. "Marguerite Reynolds." Xavier nodded, placing his hat back on his head. "Well, Miss Reynolds, that coffee's getting cold, and my biscuits ain't half bad if I do say so myself." Despite her fear, Marguerite's stomach growled loudly at the mention of food. Xavier's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Come on," he said, gesturing toward the door. "Storm's past, sun's out. Seems like a good morning to start fresh." Xavier's cabin was modest but meticulously maintained. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, and handcrafted furniture showed the touch of someone who took pride in their home. As promised, a pot of coffee bubbled on the stove, and the smell of freshly baked biscuits filled the air. "Sit," Xavier said, pulling out a chair at the rough-hewn table. "You look about ready to fall over." Marguerite sank gratefully into the chair, watching as her host moved efficiently around the small kitchen. He poured coffee into a chipped mug and placed it before her, then added a plate piled with biscuits and a jar of amber honey. "Thank you," she murmured, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. Xavier settled across from her, his own coffee in hand. "You want to tell me what happened to your face? Or who's after you?" Marguerite stiffened. "What makes you think someone's after me? Lady like you doesn't end up in my barn in the middle of the night unless she's running from something." His gaze was steady. "Or someone." She looked down at her coffee, watching the steam rise. "My husband," she finally admitted. He's not a kind man." Xavier's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "We live in Fort Smith. He works for the railroad company." The words came haltingly at first, then in a rush. "Last night was worse than usual. I thought he might kill me, so I ran." "He do that often? Hurt you?" Marguerite nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "You got family somewhere? Folks who might take you in?" "No," she whispered. "My parents died of fever 3 years ago. I married Harrison shortly after. He was different then, or I was too blind to see." Xavier took a long sip of his coffee, his expression thoughtful. "Fort Smith's a good 30 miles from here," he said finally. "But word travels fast, and men like your husband usually have friends in low places." Fear clutched at Marguerite's heart. "I should leave. I've imposed enough, and I don't want to bring trouble to your door." "And go where exactly?" Xavier's voice was gentle but firm. "Into open country with no supplies, no horse, and a man tracking you." "I don't know," she admitted. "I didn't think beyond getting away." Xavier studied her for a long moment, then set down his mug decisively. "I've got a proposition for you, Miss Reynolds. I could use some help around here. Place this size is a lot for one man to manage, especially with planting season coming on. You work for me, earn your keep, and I'll give you a safe place to stay until you figure out your next move." Marguerite stared at him in disbelief. "You do that for a stranger?" "I'm a fair judge of character," he replied. "And I reckon you're no outlaw, just someone who needs a chance." It seemed too good to be true. "What would I do? Cooking, mending, tending the vegetable garden. I've got chickens that need looking after, and the cabin could use a woman's touch." He gestured around the tidy but Spartan room. "It ain't much, but it's honest work." Hope flickered in Marguerite's chest for the first time in months. "I accept," she said quickly, before she could second-guess herself. "Thank you, Mr. Prescott." "Xav," he corrected, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "If we're going to be living and working together, might as well use my given name." Marguerite nodded, a small smile touching her lips despite the pain. "Xav," she repeated softly. He stood abruptly, as if embarrassed by the moment of connection. "There's a small room off the back of the cabin. Used to be for my mother before she passed 2 winters back. It's yours for as long as you need it." As she followed him to what would be her new quarters, Marguerite wondered if she had made the right decision. She was, after all, alone with a man she barely knew in the middle of nowhere. But something about Xavier Prescott's straightforward manner and the kindness in his eyes made her believe she could trust him. For now, at least, she had found a haven. The next week passed in a blur of new routines. True to his word, Xavier was a fair employer, never asking more of Marguerite than she could give. She took to her duties with enthusiasm, grateful for the distraction from her fear and the lingering pain of her injuries. The cabin transformed under her care. She scrubbed floors, washed linens that hadn't seen soap in months, and organized the chaotic pantry. In the small kitchen garden, she pulled weeds and planted new seedlings, talking softly to the tender green shoots as if encouraging them to grow. Xavier watched her work with quiet approval, offering help when needed but mostly giving her space. They developed an easy rhythm, sharing meals and the occasional conversation, but respecting each other's privacy. At night, behind her closed door, Marguerite would touch her healing face and marvel at how quickly life could change. The bruises were fading, turning from angry purple to sickly yellow. Soon they would be gone completely, though she knew the scars inside would take much longer to heal. On the 8th day, as Marguerite hung laundry in the warm spring sunshine, she heard the approach of horses. Her heart leapt into her throat as she ducked behind the billowing sheets, peering anxiously toward the road. 2 riders appeared, their horses kicking up dust as they approached the cabin. Relief flooded through her when she realized neither was Harrison, but her fear wasn't entirely quelled. Strangers could mean questions, and questions could lead back to her husband. Xavier emerged from the barn, rifle in hand but held casually at his side. He raised a hand in greeting as the riders drew closer. "Afternoon, Sheriff," he called. "What brings you out this way?" Marguerite's blood ran cold. A sheriff would surely be looking for a runaway wife. The older of the 2 men, a weathered individual with a silver star pinned to his vest, dismounted with a grunt. "Prescott," he acknowledged. "Just making rounds. Heard you might have company these days." Xavier's posture remained relaxed, but Marguerite could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "News travels fast," he remarked. "Small territory," the sheriff replied. "Miller over at the general store mentioned you bought twice your usual supplies last week. Said you mentioned having hired help." "That's right," Xavier confirmed. "Got a lady helping with the place. Turns out a bachelor's cabin needs more than just sweeping now and then." The sheriff's companion, a younger man with a deputy's badge, leaned forward in his saddle. This lady got a name. Marguerite held her breath, frozen behind the laundry. Miss Reynolds, Xavier answered smoothly. She's from up Kansas way, looking for a fresh start after losing her folks. The lie was delivered so convincingly that Marguerite almost believed it herself. Kansas, huh? The sheriff scratched his chin. Funny coincidence. Got word from Fort Smith about a woman gone missing. Husband's real torn up about it. Says she was touched in the head, might have wandered off. That's so. Xavier's voice remained neutral. Yep, Mrs. Harrison Walters. Dark hair, pretty thing by all accounts, though given to fits of melancholy. Husband's offering a reward for information. Marguerite felt dizzy with fear. Harrison was looking for her under her married name, which she hadn't shared with Xavier. If the sheriff asked to meet the mysterious Miss Reynolds, would Xavier connect the dots? Haven't seen anyone matching that description, Xavier said firmly. But I'll keep an eye out. The sheriff nodded, glancing around the property. Mind if I meet this Kansas girl of yours? Just to be thorough. Marguerite's hands trembled violently. She was trapped. She rode into town this morning, Xavier replied without hesitation. Needed some personal items Miller doesn't stock. Shouldn't be back till supper time. The sheriff looked disappointed but nodded. Well, when she returns, you might mention we're looking for this Walters woman. Husband's mighty worried. I'll do that, Xavier promised. You boys want some water before you head back. It's a hot ride to town. The offer was accepted, and Marguerite remained hidden as the men watered their horses and shared brief conversation. When they finally rode away, she emerged shakily from behind the laundry, her face pale. Xavier watched the departing riders until they disappeared over the rise, then turned to Marguerite. You're Harrison Walters' wife, he said flatly. It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway, her throat tight with fear. I didn't lie about why I left, she whispered. I just didn't tell you everything. You think I'm going to turn you in, collect that reward? His blue eyes were unreadable. Are you? She asked, hating the tremor in her voice. Xavier stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. No, Marguerite. I ain't in the business of sending women back to men who beat them. He ran a hand through his hair, sighing heavily. But you should have told me the whole truth. Can't protect you properly if I don't know what I'm up against. Relief made her knees weak. I'm sorry, she said. I was afraid. Harrison has connections, money, people listen to him. And now he's using those connections to hunt you down. Xavier's expression darkened. We need to be more careful. No trips to town for you, not for a while. And if anyone comes asking, you're my cousin from Kansas, here to help after my mother passed. Why are you doing this? Marguerite asked, the question that had been lingering in her mind for days finally spilling out. Why risk yourself for me? Xavier looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Let's just say I know something about men who hurt women, he said quietly. My father wasn't much different from your Harrison. Watched him put my mother through hell for 15 years before consumption finally took her. His jaw tightened. Promised myself I'd never be that man, and never stand by while another man did the same. The confession hung in the air between them, creating a new understanding. Marguerite stepped forward impulsively and touched his arm. Thank you, she said simply. Xavier nodded, momentarily covering her hand with his own before moving away. Better finish that laundry, he said gruffly. Looks like rain coming later. As she returned to her task, Marguerite felt something shift inside her, the first fragile bloom of trust, taking root where fear had reigned for so long. Summer arrived in a blaze of heat and golden light. The days grew longer, filled with work that left Marguerite's skin sun-kissed and her muscles strong. The vegetable garden flourished under her care, yielding tender greens, plump tomatoes, and sweet corn that they ate straight from the stalk, juice running down their chins as they laughed in the evening shade. Xavier taught her to ride, patient as she overcame her initial fear of the gentle mare he'd chosen for her. Soon, they were taking early morning rides across the property, surveying the small wheat field he'd planted and checking the fences that kept his modest herd of cattle contained. They fell into comfortable routines, working side by side during the day and sharing quiet evenings on the porch, watching fireflies rise from the tall grass as they talked about everything and nothing. Xavier told stories of his childhood, of learning to rope and ride before he could properly walk, of his dreams to expand the ranch someday. Marguerite shared memories of her parents, of the books her school teacher mother had read to her, of the small pleasures that had once filled her life. Neither mentioned Harrison, though his shadow sometimes fell across Marguerite's thoughts, especially when strangers passed on the distant road or when the wind carried the sound of approaching hoofbeats. But as weeks turned into months with no sign of her husband, she began to breathe more easily, to laugh more freely. And she began to notice things about Xavier that had nothing to do with gratitude or safety, the way sunlight caught in his hair when he removed his hat, the strength of his hands as they worked alongside hers, the deep timbre of his voice when he sang old trail songs while mending tack in the evenings. One scorching July afternoon, they were repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by a wayward steer. Xavier stripped off his shirt as they worked, revealing sun-browned skin and the lean muscles of a man accustomed to hard labor. Marguerite found herself stealing glances, her cheeks flushing with more than just the heat when Xavier caught her looking. A slow smile spread across his face. "Something on your mind, Marguerite?" She busied herself with the fence post, embarrassed at being caught staring. "Just wondering if we'll finish before dark," she lied. MMHMM. His tone made it clear he didn't believe her, but he didn't press the issue. Later, as they walked back toward the cabin in the golden light of sunset, their hands brushed accidentally. The brief contact sent a jolt of awareness through Marguerite, and she pulled away quickly, confused by her own reaction. "You're jumpy today," Xavier observed, glancing at her curiously. "It's nothing," she assured him, avoiding his gaze, but it wasn't nothing, and they both knew it. Something was changing between them, something neither had acknowledged but both increasingly felt. That night, a summer storm rolled in, fierce and sudden. Lightning split the sky and thunder shook the cabin's sturdy walls. Marguerite sat up in bed, listening to the rain lash against her window. A particularly loud crack of thunder made her flinch, and before she could think better of it, she was out of bed and padding toward the main room of the cabin. Xavier was still awake, sitting by the fire with a book open on his lap. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening at the sight of her in her nightdress, a shawl hastily wrapped around her shoulders. "Storm keeping you up?" he asked. Marguerite nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "I've never liked thunder," she admitted. "Silly, I know. Not silly at all." He gestured to the chair opposite his. "Company makes it less frightening, I find." She settled into the offered seat, watching the fires dance across his features. For a while they sat in comfortable silence, the storm raging outside while they remained safe and warm within. "I've been thinking," Xavier said finally, closing his book. "You've been here 3 months now. Seems like your husband's given up the search." Marguerite's heart sank. Was he asking her to leave? "Perhaps," she agreed cautiously. "You could go anywhere now," he continued, his voice carefully neutral. "Start fresh somewhere he'd never think to look. California, maybe, or up to Montana territory." "Are you suggesting I should go?" she asked, unable to keep the hurt from her voice. Xavier looked up sharply. "No," he said emphatically. That's not what I'm saying at all." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of inner struggle. "I'm saying you have choices now. You're not trapped anymore. And if my choice is to stay—" The words slipped out before she could stop them. The firelight caught the hope that flared in his eyes. "Is it?" he asked quietly. Marguerite looked down at her hands, at the calluses she'd developed from honest work, at the absence of the wedding ring she'd thrown away months ago. "I like it here," she said softly. "I like the life we've built." Xavier set his book aside and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Marguerite," he began, her name a caress on his lips. "I need to say something, and I need you to know you're free to respond however you want." She nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. "I've grown mighty fond of you," he said simply. "More than fond, if I'm being honest, and I hope you might feel something similar." The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Marguerite felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sadness but from a complicated tangle of emotions: fear, hope, longing. "I do," she whispered, "but I'm afraid." "Of what?" "Of trusting my own judgment, of being wrong again." She twisted her shawl between her fingers. "I thought Harrison loved me once." Xavier nodded solemnly. "That's fair. And I won't push you, but I want you to know that whatever you decide, this is your home for as long as you want it to be. No strings attached." A tear slipped down Marguerite's cheek. "You're a good man, Xavier Prescott." "I try to be," he said with a small smile. "Not always successful, but I try." Another crash of thunder made her jump, and Xavier rose from his chair, offering his hand. "Come on," he said gently. "I'll walk you back to your room." Marguerite placed her hand in his, allowing him to help her to her feet. But instead of moving toward the hallway, she stepped closer to him, her heart in her throat. "Xav," she said, using the nickname she rarely spoke aloud, "I'm not afraid of you. I'm afraid of myself. Of wanting too much, too soon." His eyes searched hers, understanding dawning. "We've got all the time in the world," he assured her. "No need to rush anything." In answer, Marguerite rose on her tiptoes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. "Thank you," she murmured, "for everything." As she turned to go, Xavier caught her hand, drawing her back. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he bent his head and brushed his lips against hers in a kiss so tender it brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Good night, Marguerite," he whispered against her mouth. "Good night, Xav," she replied, her voice unsteady. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within the cabin, something new and fragile had taken root, the first tentative shoots of love growing from soil that had once seemed too damaged to nurture anything beautiful. Autumn painted the countryside in vibrant golds and reds, transforming Xavier's modest ranch into a canvas of seasonal splendor. The days grew shorter, the nights cooler, and Marguerite found herself cherishing the evenings spent before the fire with Xavier, their relationship evolving with cautious joy. They moved slowly, both aware of the shadows in Marguerite's past. Xavier never pushed, never demanded, content to let her set the pace of their growing intimacy. A kiss good morning, hands clasped while walking to the barn, sitting close together as they shelled peas or mended clothes, small gestures that gradually built a foundation of trust and affection. One crisp October day, they rode into town together for supplies. It was Marguerite's first visit to the small settlement since her arrival at the ranch, and though she was nervous, Xavier assured her Harrison's search had long since moved elsewhere. "Besides," he added with a wink, "no one's going to recognize you now." He was right. The frightened, bruised woman who had stumbled into his barn that stormy night had been transformed. Marguerite sat tall in her saddle, her once gaunt cheeks now filled out, her skin glowing with health, her eyes bright with confidence. She wore a simple blue dress that Xavier had purchased for her, her dark hair neatly braided and tucked beneath a modest bonnet. The town was little more than a dusty main street lined with essential businesses: a general store, a smithy, a small church, and a combination saloon and hotel. As they hitched their horses outside the general store, Marguerite felt eyes upon them, curious glances from locals eager for new faces and fresh gossip. "Remember," Xavier murmured as he helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist, "you're my cousin from Kansas." Inside the store, the proprietor greeted Xavier warmly. "Prescott, been a while since you graced us with your presence." "Been busy with the harvest, Miller," Xavier replied, removing his hat. "This here's my cousin, Miss Reynolds. She's been helping me since Ma passed." Miller, a rotund man with impressive whiskers, nodded approvingly at Marguerite. "Pleasure, madam. Heard Prescott had a lady out at his place, but you know how folks talk. Glad to finally meet you proper." As they gathered their supplies, Marguerite became aware of a stir near the door. A man had entered, tall, well-dressed, with the unmistakable look of someone accustomed to authority. Her heart stuttered when she saw the badge on his chest. "Afternoon, Marshal," Miller called. "What brings you to our humble establishment?" The marshal nodded in acknowledgement. "Just passing through on my way back to Fort Smith. Thought I'd check if there's been any word about that Walters woman." Marguerite froze, her fingers tightening on the bolt of fabric she'd been examining. Xavier moved subtly closer to her, his body partially shielding her from view. "The runaway wife?" Miller asked. "Nah, that was months ago. Trail's gone cold, I reckon," the marshal sighed. "Seems that way. Husband's still looking, though. Stubborn man." "Maybe she don't want to be found," Miller suggested. "Heard rumors that Walters' fellow wasn't exactly gentle with his missus." "That's between a man and his wife," the marshal replied dismissively. "Law says she belongs with her husband." Marguerite felt sick, the store suddenly too warm, too confining. Xavier must have sensed her distress, for he quickly finalized their purchases and guided her toward the door. As they passed the marshal, he tipped his hat politely. "Afternoon, folks." "Marshal," Xavier acknowledged curtly, keeping his arm protectively around Marguerite's shoulders. Outside, Marguerite gulped the fresh air, trying to calm her racing heart. "He didn't recognize me," she whispered in disbelief. "Told you," Xavier replied, loading their supplies into saddlebags. "You're not the same woman anymore." They rode home in thoughtful silence, each processing what they'd overheard. As the ranch came into view, Xavier cleared his throat. "Marguerite," he began hesitantly, "what that marshal said about the law, he's right. In the eyes of the law, you're still Harrison Walters' wife." She nodded, her expression somber. "I know. It means you can't ever truly be free unless I divorce him," she finished, "or he divorces me." Xavier guided his horse closer to hers. "There's another option," he said quietly. "We could leave. Go west to California or up to the Dakota Territory. Somewhere beyond his reach." Marguerite considered this, imagining a life on the run, always looking over their shoulders. "No," she said finally. "I don't want to live in fear anymore, Xav. I want to face this head on." He studied her with admiration. "What do you want to do?" "I want to file for divorce," she declared, the words both terrifying and liberating. "I want my freedom legally and completely." Xavier nodded, pride evident in his expression. "It won't be easy. Courts don't often side with wives in these matters. I know, but I have to try." She straightened in her saddle, determination setting her jaw. And then, he prompted when she hesitated. Marguerite looked at him, allowing herself to imagine a future she'd barely dared to dream of. "And then, if you still want me, I'd like to build a life here. With you." The joy that transformed Xavier's face was answer enough, but he reached across the space between them to take her hand, bringing it to his lips. "Nothing would make me happier," he vowed. That evening, after a simple supper, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Xavier took Marguerite's hand, his expression serious. "Before you make any decisions about our future," he said, "there's something you should know about me." Marguerite tensed, prepared for some revelation that might change everything. "I'm not a wealthy man," he continued. "This ranch is modest, and while it provides a good living, we'll never be rich. The work is hard, the winters can be brutal, and there are no guarantees the crops will yield or the cattle will thrive." Relief flooded through her. "Is that all?" she asked with a small laugh. "Xavier, I've never cared about money or status. I've lived that life, and it brought me nothing but pain." He squeezed her hand. "There's more. If you choose to stay to be my wife someday, I want you to know what that means to me." His voice grew husky with emotion. "It means partnership in everything. Your thoughts and opinions would matter as much as mine. Your dreams would become my dreams, and I would spend every day trying to be worthy of your trust." Tears welled in Marguerite's eyes at the simple, heartfelt declaration. "I already trust you," she whispered. "More than I've ever trusted anyone." Xavier released her hand only to cup her face gently. "May I kiss you, Marguerite Reynolds?" In answer, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a kiss filled with promise and newfound certainty. His arms encircled her, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened, expressing feelings too profound for words. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "Have for months now." Joy bubbled up within Marguerite, bright and pure. "I love you too," she replied, the words feeling right, feeling true in a way she'd never experienced before. As twilight settled around them, they remained on the porch, talking of practical matters, how to approach a divorce petition, which lawyer to consult in Fort Smith, how to prepare for the possibility of confronting Harrison. But beneath the practicalities ran a current of shared certainty. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The legal battle proved every bit as difficult as they had anticipated. The lawyer they consulted in Fort Smith, a young, idealistic man named Johnson, warned that divorces were rarely granted to women, especially on grounds of cruelty without substantial proof. "Your word against his won't be enough," he cautioned. "And if he contests it, which he almost certainly will, the process could take months, even years." But Marguerite was determined, and Xavier stood steadfastly by her side, accompanying her to every meeting, providing financial support for the legal fees, and offering emotional strength when her courage wavered. Winter descended on the territory, bringing howling winds and heavy snow that isolated the ranch for days at a time. They used the enforced seclusion to grow closer, sharing stories by firelight, teaching each other skills, Xavier showing Marguerite how to play chess, she teaching him to make her mother's bread recipe. By unspoken agreement, they maintained separate sleeping quarters, both aware that until Marguerite was legally free, anything more would compromise her already precarious position in the eyes of the law and society. But their restrained passion found other outlets, lingering kisses in the lamplight, hands clasped beneath blankets as they read together, whispered promises of a future where they wouldn't need to hold back. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and the promise of new beginnings. The divorce petition had been filed, and Harrison had responded predictably with outrage and denial. A court date was set for May, ironically, what would have been their third wedding anniversary. As the day approached, Marguerite's anxiety grew. Xavier found her one evening in the garden, staring unseeingly at the young plants she'd tenderly cultivated. "What if he convinces them?" she asked without preamble. "What if they make me go back to him?" Xavier knelt beside her in the soft earth, taking her trembling hands in his. "That won't happen," he assured her. "Johnson is confident. We have witnesses now, neighbors who saw your injuries, the sheriff who noticed your bruises that first day, and even if the worst happens, I won't let him take you. We'll leave, just like we discussed before." Marguerite leaned into his strength, drawing comfort from his unwavering support. "I'm tired of being afraid," she admitted. "I want this to be over." "It will be," he promised, "one way or another." The courthouse in Fort Smith was crowded the day of the hearing, curious onlookers, drawn by the unusual spectacle of a wife seeking divorce from a prominent railroad man. Marguerite sat rigidly beside her lawyer. Her simple blue dress and modest had a stark contrast to the elaborate fashions of the town ladies who had come to watch the proceedings. Xavier sat directly behind her, close enough that she could feel his reassuring presence. They had barely spoken that morning, both tense with anticipation of the confrontation to come. When Harrison entered, flanked by his own lawyer and several associates, Marguerite forced herself not to flinch. He looked much as she remembered, handsome in a conventional way, expensively dressed, his smile charming as he nodded to acquaintances in the crowd. Only she knew the cruelty that lay beneath that polished exterior. His eyes found her, narrowing with a mixture of anger and calculation. Then his gaze shifted to Xavier, and his expression darkened further. The judge, a stern-faced man with spectacles perched on his nose, called the court to order. The proceedings began with formal statements from both lawyers, followed by testimony from Marguerite about the abuse she had suffered during her marriage. Speaking the truth aloud in a public forum was both terrifying and liberating. Her voice shook at first, but grew stronger as she recounted the escalating violence, the isolation, the fear that had become her constant companion. Harrison's lawyer cross-examined her aggressively, suggesting she had fabricated the abuse to cover her own infidelity, implying that her relationship with Xavier had begun before she left her husband. "And isn't it true, Mrs. Walters," he demanded, "that you stole money from your husband's safe before abandoning your marital duties?" "I took only what was mine," Marguerite replied steadily. "The money my parents left me, which Harrison controlled but never legally owned." When Xavier took the stand, his testimony was measured and dignified. Yes, he had given Marguerite shelter. No, there had been no impropriety. Yes, he had seen the evidence of abuse with his own eyes, the bruises, the split lip, the terror that had taken months to fade from her gaze. Harrison testified last, presenting himself as a devoted husband bewildered by his wife's abandonment. He denied the abuse categorically, suggesting that Marguerite's injuries had been self-inflicted during episodes of hysteria. "My wife has always been fragile," he told the court with practiced concern. "I indulged her too much, perhaps, but I never, ever raised a hand to her." It was a convincing performance, and Marguerite felt despair creeping in as she watched several jurors nodding sympathetically. But then, unexpectedly, a woman rose from the gallery. "That's a lie," she called clearly. "Harrison Walters is a violent man, and everyone in his household knows it." The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the judge banged his gavel. "Who are you, madam?" he demanded. "Sarah Collins, Your Honor." "I was the Walters housekeeper for 2 years." The woman, middle-aged and plainly dressed, stepped forward. "I saw what he did to her, heard her cries at night, helped clean her blood from the carpet more than once." Harrison's face contorted with rage. "She's lying. I fired her for stealing." "You fired me because I threatened to tell what I knew," Sarah countered steadily. "And I wasn't the only one. Ask any of the staff who worked in that house." The judge permitted Sarah to testify formally, her account corroborating Marguerite's in every detail. By the time she finished, the mood in the courtroom had shifted palpably. After hours of testimony and argument, the judge retired to consider his ruling. Marguerite waited in an antechamber with Xavier and her lawyer, too nervous to speak. When they were called back, the judge's expression gave nothing away. He adjusted his spectacles, surveyed the packed courtroom, and cleared his throat. In the matter of Reynolds versus Walters, I find sufficient evidence of extreme cruelty to justify dissolution of the marriage contract. His voice was firm and carrying. The divorce is granted. Mrs. Walters, or rather, Miss Reynolds, as she has chosen to reclaim her maiden name, is released from all marital obligations and retains her personal property and inheritance. Relief crashed over Marguerite in a dizzying wave. She swayed slightly, steadied by Xavier's hand at her elbow. Harrison's face flushed dark with fury, but his lawyer restrained him from approaching as the judge continued. Furthermore, Mr. Walters is ordered to pay court costs and legal fees, and is forbidden from attempting to contact Miss Reynolds in the future. It was more than they had dared to hope for a complete victory. As they left the courthouse, Marguerite clung to Xavier's arm, hardly able to believe it was truly over. "You're free," he murmured, guiding her through the dispersing crowd. Legally and completely free, tears of joy blurred her vision. "Take me home, Xav," she whispered. "Take me home." The journey back to the ranch seemed both interminable and over too quickly. They rode mostly in silence, each processing the events of the day, the reality of this new beginning. As they crested the final hill, the cabin came into view, golden in the late afternoon sunlight. Xavier reined his horse to a stop, and Marguerite did the same, both gazing down at the place that had become her sanctuary and, gradually, her home. "I have something to ask you," Xavier said, turning in his saddle to face her. "Something I've been waiting to ask for a long time." Marguerite's heart quickened. "Yes." Xavier dismounted and came to help her down from her horse. But instead of releasing her once her feet touched the ground, he kept hold of her hands and, to her astonishment, lowered himself to one knee. "Marguerite Reynolds," he began, his voice husky with emotion, "when you came into my life, you were running from pain and fear. You've shown more courage and strength than anyone I've ever known, and watching you reclaim your life has been the greatest privilege of mine." Tears welled in Marguerite's eyes as she realized what was happening. "I love you," Xavier continued, "not just for who you are, but for who I become when I'm with you. You make me want to be better, to build something lasting and true." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, a simple gold band set with a single pearl. "This was my mother's. She made me promise I'd only give it to someone I loved with my whole heart." Marguerite's tears spilled over, tracking silently down her cheeks. "Will you marry me, Marguerite? Will you build a life with me, here on this land?" For a moment, she couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. Then, with a joy so fierce it felt like pain, she nodded. "Yes," she managed. "Yes, Xavier Prescott, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her in his arms. Their kiss was a promise, a pledge of all that would come: days of work and nights of tenderness, challenges met together and joys multiplied by sharing. When they finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "Welcome home, Marguerite," he murmured. "For good this time." Hand in hand, they led their horses down the slope toward the cabin, toward the future they would build together. Behind them, the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of promise and possibility. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Marguerite stood in the small church in town, wearing a new dress of ivory silk and holding a bouquet of late wildflowers. Xavier waited for her at the altar, his expression one of wonder as she walked toward him. Their vows were simple but profound, exchanged before a congregation of neighbors and friends who had come to know and respect them both. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheers and applause filled the little church to its rafters. The celebration continued at the ranch, where tables groaned with food contributed by well-wishers, and lanterns cast a golden glow over dancers in the yard. As twilight deepened, Xavier led his bride away from the festivities to the newly expanded cabin, where he had added rooms in anticipation of the family they both hoped to create. On the porch, before crossing the threshold, he paused to kiss her with tender reverence. "Happy?" he asked softly. Marguerite looked up at the man who had taught her what love truly was: not possession or control, but partnership and respect, passion tempered with gentleness, strength that never threatened but always protected. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she answered, her heart full to overflowing. "And this is just the beginning." Xavier smiled, lifting her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "Just the beginning," he agreed, his voice a promise that echoed in her heart like the sweetest music she had ever heard.